this group about 4 years ago or so. I'm not as young as I used to be. Bill and I both are not as young. I just have some knee problems. I don't know how long I'll be able to stand up, but I'll try to do my best, and maybe I'll have to sit down as the presentations go on. I'm going to be here with you for 2 days and speaking a lot about the founding era of American history. Bill has told you a little bit about me. We were in the graduate seminar together with Merrill Jensen, and I'll mention a little bit about that a little later on when I talk about the American Revolution. But Jensen got the first federal elections project in 1966. I worked on that in 1968, and then he was named the second editor of the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. That project actually began in 1951. The founding fathers took 4 months to draft the Constitution. The American people took 9 months to ratify it, and it will take us about 70 years to document that. And we're in the home stretch. We've published 21 volumes so far of the documentary edition, and we'll probably end up with about 28 volumes when we're finished. Those volumes are now being placed on the internet by Rotunda, which has been purchased here by Concord University. And we'll talk about that tomorrow, some to show you how you might utilize that documentary collection, much broader than the ratification of the Constitution project. There was no staff of the ratification project for the first 10 years. Staff of the National Archives went out to the major libraries on the East Coast to see what was available. No one knew what kind of documents were available. And after 10 years of collecting, they had a room assigned with that was gathering not only the microfilm that was being collected, people filming, but also Xerox copies. And then when the film came, that was sent over to the Naval Department, and they ran a Xerox copy flow, just one consecutive flow of paper coming out. And there were stacks and stacks of these documents, 18th century documents, in that room, but no staff. Finally, there was private money, because there was no federal money at this time for this kind of thing. Private money was made available from the Ford Foundation, and a staff was hired. The project would take 5 or 6 years maybe, so the idea was, and so they hired a retired political science professor from Cornell. Now, he did a lot of the searching and finished one volume, was sent to in manuscript form, sent to the board of editors, and they rejected it. He revised it, and they rejected it again. Then he died, the editor. Well, on the board of editors was, among other people, Julian Boyd, the first editor of the Jefferson Papers, Lyman Butterfield, the first editor of the Adams Papers, Merrill Jensen, editing the first federal elections project, Justice William Brennan from the Supreme Court, and these people rejected that volume that was put forth by the first editor, and they asked Jensen if he would take on the project, and he did. And so he hired me in 1969. So I've been working with that project for over 41 years now, and looking forward to it being completed. I don't know if I'll complete it myself. I won't complete the whole project, but I'm hoping to complete the state series. And then there'll be the Bill of Rights series that follows that. So that's what I'm doing with my main job at the University of Wisconsin. And it's a pleasure to be working with documents all the time. I get to read the letters of individuals. I get to know them very well. And that's what I hope to introduce you to. And I hope that with the documents that are online and the documentary editions that are available, that you will have a tremendous opportunity available to you and to your students. You can utilize this material What's your name? No, back right behind. Yes. Tricia. Patricia came in today, and she was so excited with the documents that she had found. And I think that's what happens when you get involved with documents. You can get very excited as to what they have available. And it's sort of an addictive thing. I wanted to be a high school teacher. That's what I planned to be when I first started out. And then I eventually went on for the PhD with Jensen, and then became a documentary editor and have continued it my entire career. I've done some teaching, and I do a lot of teaching now, not in the classroom to students, but I teach federal judges all around the country. Usually give 10 one-day seminars to federal judges all over. I give seminars to other judges, state judges, Native American judges, military judges. I'm on the faculty of the National Judicial College in Reno, Nevada, so I go there usually once or twice a year to teach judges, state judges there. But I also like to talk to teacher groups, and I talk to maybe about 10 or 15 teacher groups a year. And I think these are two very important groups, judges and teachers. I don't think you can get two more important groups in our country. And so what I'd like to do today and tomorrow is to expose you to some of the events that took place in our early founding, going from colonial times up until, I'm going to, if we have time, I'll violate my rule. My rule is this: I am an 18th century historian of the American Revolution. Anything after 1800 is current events. And I'm not a journalist. And so I don't go beyond 1800. When I speak with judges, they're conservative judges, they're liberal judges, and they always want me to take a position. And I don't. And they know my position is that I don't get involved in that kind of thing. I go back to the judges over and over again. So I've been to Georgia 6 or 7 times. I've been to Oklahoma City 6 or 7 times, and on and on and on. So I know the judges very well now. We're good friends. And they know better than to ask me something current, although they always do. What I wanted to do, the very first thing here, is something that I've never done before. And I just decided that maybe this would be a good idea to do this when I was between flights in Detroit yesterday. I was at the Sky Club, and I had 3 hours to wait for my next flight. And so during that time, I sort of drafted things that I think will be important for you as a budding historian. And that's what I want you to think of yourselves as. Whether you teach elementary, middle, or high school, you're going to be a pseudo-historian. You're going to be working with documents. And I want you to be aware, when you're working with documents, what cautions there are for you. And this is not just for working with documents. It's working with history also. And it's for the writers of history, but also the readers of history, and for those who are just looking at history, particularly on TV or docudramas, or how many of you saw The Patriot? Okay, wonderful, right? I didn't like it very much. How about 1776? How many of you have seen 1776? Okay. How many of you like that? I watch it every 4th of July. I watched it stretched over 5 minutes into the 5th of July. This year I watched it late at night. But I greatly admire that movie, although it's filled with errors. And you have to understand that. Only one is a real serious error. The others are not so serious. But you should be aware of these things when you are reading, writing, or trying to teach history. These are all things that are important. And I usually don't like to make up lists, because I figure after, if I've got a list of 10, when I get to 6 or 7, you're exhausted. Well, I violated my rule here again, and I've got more than 20 here. So it's a long list for us to get through. But we'll start off. The first thing to understand when you're dealing with history is that whatever history we read or we write, it's infinitesimal. What is history? History is everything. Everything. Just think of your own life. That's your history. From the time you were born until the time you die, that's your history. And it takes place over 60 or 70 year period of time. How can you tell that history? We can only hit the high points. And that's what it is with our country. For us to tell the entire history is just impossible. And so we're only going to be hitting the high points of that history, knowing that it's just a tiny, tiny fraction. And therefore, it is not necessarily going to be accurate. To be accurate, we should see the entire picture. We can't see the entire picture. We can't see the entire picture of any one person, let alone the millions of people who have lived in our country or other countries. So that's the first thing. Understand that whatever history you're reading, it doesn't make any difference, even if it's the ratification of the Constitution documentary series that has 30 volumes in it. It's still very infinitesimal in relation to what really occurred. Another thing that's just something that's obvious, but nobody thinks about it, and it's something that you must realize, that is, nothing was inevitable. Nothing was inevitable. There is the sense when you read history that the English settled colonies in America. I think I'm going to sit down, make me feel a little easier. There is the sense that the English settled in America, and eventually they oppress the Americans, and Americans have too much of it, and they declare their independence. They achieve their independence, they have a little bit of troubles, and they write their Constitution and a Bill of Rights, and we're off to the races, right? It's just going to happen. I was at Montpelier a couple weeks ago, James Madison's home, and two scholars were talking. Ralph Ketchum was one. I don't know if any of you know Ralph Ketchum. He's almost 90 years old now. He wrote the definitive biography of James Madison. It's probably about 800 pages long. And Ralph and this other scholar that were speaking, talking about James Madison's role. And the way they were speaking, it was inevitable that he would do what he did in drafting the Constitution. And it just dawned on me then that was really diminishing the role that Madison played. If you have a sense of inevitability, then it's not so significant what Madison did. But if you believe that this was an extraordinary human being who, for some reason, decided that the country's fate was on his shoulders, this tiny little guy, soft-spoken, sick as can be most of the time. He had irritable bowel syndrome, we'd call it today, so stress really affected him. He had perhaps one of the worst cases of hemorrhoids in American history. And so when he went to Congress riding on a horse, he was in utter pain. He wouldn't go out on a ship. Never does Madison go out on a ship because he has some form of epilepsy, that he's afraid if he goes out on a ship with the rocking and rolling of the ship, it'll cause a fit and he might die. So you'll never find James Madison on a ship. And so there's something about him, though, in 1786 when he's named ambassador to The Hague, ambassador to Madrid. He can't go, partly because he doesn't want to go out on the ship, but partly he knows his role is to be in the United States in 1786, 1787, when there are bigger fish to fry, when he is going to be contributing. Why he feels that he is the one that's going to take the lead, I have no idea. Why he feels he is the one that should take the notes in the Constitutional Convention, I know why he does, but why he actually does it, participating in the debate and taking the notes, the extensive notes, he said it almost killed him. Why he feels he has to do this, I'm not sure. You have a question?
No, well, a little bit. I mean, I'm thinking about Madison's my favorite of the founding fathers, but if without him, we wouldn't have had any knowledge of what went on at all. So I think he played the most pivotal role of anybody.
Well, there are a half dozen others that wrote notes. His are the most extensive by far, more than doubling what all the others were together, and so it's critical. But this is a question that I have. I like counterfactual history. You know what counterfactual history is? What would have happened if this occurred? So it's counterfactual, no facts, just guesswork here. What would have happened if Madison didn't take those notes? And you know, his notes to the Constitutional Convention were not published in his lifetime, and he had a whole list of reasons why. They were published in 1840. He died in 1836. So who is the most famous Chief Justice of the United States? John Marshall, right? 35 years Chief Justice. He never saw James Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention. So you say we wouldn't have known very much. John Marshall didn't know what took place in the Constitutional Convention. He gave his opinion on about 90 constitutional issues. He wrote the opinion on most of them, and he was in the minority once in all those. If he had Madison's notes, he would not have been in the minority that one time. It was an issue of bankruptcy, and the convention did talk about it, and it is in Madison's notes. But Marshall took a different point of view. Yes?
Well, my question, I guess, would be then, what are the differences between Madison's notes versus the other, I don't know who else wrote the other people that wrote there. Have you seen the other notes too?
Oh, sure. Max Ferran is the primary editor of the, it's called the Records of the Federal Convention of 1787. 3 volumes published in 1911, and then a 4th volume was added in 1937. And that's been the standard documentary edition for a long, long time. And you've got the notes of Hamilton, Robert Yates, Rufus King, David Brealey, a number of other people as well. And most of them corroborate what Madison says. And so they might amplify a little bit. One of the things about Madison's notes to the convention is that he's highly criticized by James Hudson. Hudson is the curator of manuscripts at the Library of Congress. He's been there many, many years. I used to play tennis with him when I was at Washington, D.C., moving the project out of the National Archives in 1970 back to Madison, Wisconsin. And so I played tennis with Jim Hudson just outside of the Library of Congress back in the summer of 1970. So he's still there, about ready to retire. And he has published an article, Texas Law Review, denigrating the note takers. Not just James Madison in the Constitutional Convention, but also the note takers in the various ratifying conventions. James Robertson took the notes in the Virginia ratifying convention. 3 volumes, each volume 200 pages long, 600 pages on the Virginia ratifying convention. And what Hudson says is there's no way that these men could capture the amount of spoken word in so short a period of space. He says that, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's something like this. In any hour, 8,000 words would be spoken. And this convention, the Constitutional Convention, met for 4 to 7 hours a day for 4 months. So there's a lot that was spoken. Madison records about 250 words an hour, if you would average it out. So 8,000 versus 250. How much can he be talking about? How much can he be writing down? He is not a stenographer. He is not taking down a stenographic copy of the debates. But Madison was an experienced note taker. That is, he took notes in the Confederation Congress. And what he did was he knew Robert Byrd just died. Robert Byrd was one of the great senators that we've had. And if he spoke, let's say he spoke for an hour, I could summarize what he said in 2 minutes, right? I get rid of the gobbledygook that's there. Everett Dirksen was, I was raised in Illinois. Everett Dirksen, I don't know if you know Everett Dirksen. He was one of the great 19th century orators in my lifetime. He was a hanger-on from the 19th century. But Madison knew how to get rid of the flowery stuff, oratory. He knew the big picture, and then he knew point by point by point afterwards. And that's how he took his notes. And he took them in English, he took them in abbreviations of English, and he took them in his own shorthand symbols that he had, and then he expanded upon them. Hudson says his notes for his speeches were longer than anything else. Well, of course, because they weren't notes, they were his that were taken afterwards. He wrote the notes down beforehand. Before he gave the speech, he had the notes when he was giving the speech. And so they were more extensive. And if you look at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, there's absolutely no way that James Robertson could have been as adept a writer to get the scholarship of Madison and the passion of Patrick Henry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's changing persona when different people are speaking. Robertson is not that good. He's a great note taker, but he doesn't have the ability to switch on and off being different personalities. And so he could capture what was spoken. So I think these notes are indeed accurate. I'll give you an example, though. You ask what's the difference. In Robert Yates took notes. He and his colleague, John Lansing, left on the 10th of July, never to return. And so you only have a limited amount of time that Yates's notes took place. He made a copy of the notes for John Lansing. Lansing disappeared. One day he went out for a walk. This is in the early 19th century, and never came back. And his body was never found. He's just gone. But the copy that he was given was then given to someone else, and eventually Citizen Genet got a copy of Yates's notes. Anyone know Citizen Genet? Edmond Genet? He was the ambassador from the French Republic during the French Revolution, 1793. He wanted to foment support for France in America. And Washington wanted to do just the opposite with his proclamation of neutrality. And so the two were at loggerheads. And eventually, we kicked Genet out. We told the French government, take him back. We don't want him. By that time, the radicals took over, and they wanted Genet back because they wanted to kill him. And Genet didn't want to go back. So we gave him asylum. He then marries George Clinton's daughter, George Clinton, the first governor of New York. Now, in 1808, George Clinton is vice president of the United States. He's an old man. He wants to be president. James Madison is Secretary of State. He wants to be president also after Jefferson retires. And so Genet writes for his father-in-law, George Clinton, and publishes an 8-page pamphlet from the notes of Robert Yates, handed down through John Lansing, kind of convoluted here, and he doctors those notes. He makes Madison to be an arch nationalist, and the notes are thus somewhat fraudulent. Madison denounces them. Well, we see the Genet papers in the Library of Congress, and we see what Genet did with those notes from Robert Yates. And in 1821, he publishes all of Robert Yates's notes, and they're all doctored. And so we see the difference there. William Jackson was the secretary of the convention. He took only a skeletal outline of what took place. Madison amplifies that. So Madison is the one who wants to give us those notes. He wants to give those notes to me. He said so. If you look at what he says, he's taking these down because when he did his research into the early confederacies, way back. He couldn't find a lot of this material. He couldn't find how the confederacies operated. And so he wanted for historians to have this information if this Constitution was going to be adopted. That's why he took the notes. As we're going along, I certainly want you to ask questions. Don't feel as if you have to wait. If you've got a question, one of your colleagues probably has the same question. So don't hesitate. Don't be bashful. Raise questions. I like to think of this inevitability. If the revolution didn't come along, George Washington would have been written down in history as one of the most successful experimental farmers in Fairfax County, Virginia. That's how we would have known George Washington. George Clinton would have been a very successful country lawyer in Ulster County, New York. James Madison, after going to the College of New Jersey, Princeton, and rejecting, didn't want to be a minister, although he studied for the ministry, didn't want to be a lawyer, although he read lots of law, didn't want to be a doctor, didn't want to be a merchant. What else is there? He wanted to be a historian or a professor of government. That's what he would have been had he didn't want to be a planter, because he didn't want to earn his living off the sweat of a race of slaves. He said that, although later he did become that. And so his biographers are often asked the question, is it the person who makes the difference, or is it the times that makes the difference? And obviously, it's always both. It's not one or the other. But sometimes there are events that are monumental, and they change the course of everyone's lives. And certainly the American Revolution was that way. It changed the course of George Washington's life. It changed the course of James Madison's life. And so I asked the question at Montpelier, what would have happened had when Madison was going home from Congress in December 1783, he had served his 3 years and 6, there's a term limit in Congress. What would have happened if there was a newspaper report, young Mr. Madison fell off his horse and drowned in the Raritan River? What would have happened if we had no James Madison? Would everything have been the same? I gave the very first talk I gave to federal judges was on 4 founding fathers: Thomas Paine, Washington, Jefferson, Madison. And after I was finished, it was a 2-day seminar, I asked them, was there any one of these 4 that was indispensable? And they all said, Washington. Washington was indispensable. There would have been another Thomas Paine, there would have been another Jefferson, and another Madison. Now, you might argue, no, there wouldn't have been another Madison. He was unique. But that's what they felt, that Washington was essential. At the end of the Constitutional Convention, Madison said to Washington, there's only one thing that has made our revolution different than all other revolutions, and that's you. One singular thing, you. Without you, we would have ended in despotism. You kept us out of despotism. Again, that's his point of view. So, inevitability. Anyone have any questions on that? I mean, try to hold off your judgment. I did a book called The Founders and the Founders, what they said about each other. And my database for that is quite extensive. The book has 30 people in it, 640 pages. The database has 430 people, 7,000 pages. So a lot more material. And I did a lot of searching of documentary editions to come up with all this information, looking at character, physical description, intellectual prowess, their day-to-day lives, to see who they were personally. And it's a wonderful collection. University of Virginia published it. And it's quite illuminating. But I was looking at the documentary edition called The Letters of Delegates to Congress. 25 volumes of documents. And to be a little different, I decided I'd go backwards. Start with volume 25. Each volume I started with page 1. I didn't go backwards in the volume. I'm crazy, but not that crazy. But in volume 17, I came across the terrible death of a congressman from North Carolina. He died of smallpox. I went back, volume 16, and this delegate is saying, I'm thinking about being inoculated for smallpox. I told him, don't do it. Don't do it. But he did it, and there's something inevitable about that. He was going to die, because I had read volume 17. I knew he was going to die. But in all of my efforts, I couldn't convince him not to get inoculated, and he died from that. That tells you a couple things. That was inevitable there, only because of the way I was working. He didn't know it was inevitable. He didn't know he was going to get this disease, which is what smallpox is. It's not a vaccination, it's inoculation. So they slit your arm, they put an infective thread with smallpox in, and they hope you get it. A mild case. John Adams had it before he got married. It took about a month and a half for him. You have to go under a physician and get treated, purge your body, have a certain diet, and then they do this and hope it takes. And then you're contagious, so you got to stay in this house. Usually they might have 5, 6, 10 people having this done, and then you're done. The hope is that you catch it. The ideal thing is you get 2 or 3 pock marks. Abigail Adams did this with their 4 kids when John was off at Congress. They had talked about this. It was going to be done. They had to do it to safeguard the kids. Abigail and John Quincy Adams, her second oldest child, oldest son, they both got 3 or 4 pock marks. Wonderful. Proof that they got inoculated. They were now safe, but not too bad. Charlie, the middle boy, did not get any pock marks. So he had to go through the procedure a second time. So that you don't want to leave thinking you're safe and you'll catch it naturally and maybe die. Nabby, their daughter, their only daughter, the oldest child, she got it and she got it bad. More than 600 pock marks all over her body. She couldn't stand, she couldn't sit, she couldn't lie. She was in total pain. Just think if you were her mother and you put her through that, hoping it would save her from getting smallpox naturally, but look what it did to her. The agony that she was in for over a week before these pock marks started to heal. What's that?
She got a weakened virus. If she got the real virus, she probably would have died. If it had affected her that bad.
Probably. But you don't know that when you see your daughter suffering the way she's suffering. And she's always going to have these pock marks. Not as bad as getting naturally, but she liked to get sunshine. That would give her some tone to her complexion rather than being white. George Washington had pock marks on his face. I don't know if you knew that. Most people don't comment on that. They don't see the pock marks on his face. They see the greatness of Washington. But if you look closely, you will see that. He got smallpox naturally when he was in Barbados, when he was 19 years old. It was a mild case, and it probably saved him. Maybe during the Revolution he would have died from smallpox. He would have been sick in all likelihood. But he got it then. Also made him sterile, so he had no children of his own. Inevitability is important. We've got to weigh things and balance them from the sources. Bill mentioned William Maclay. Who was William Maclay? Who was William Maclay? Anybody William Maclay? You don't have to raise your hand. Do you know who William Maclay was? William Maclay was one of the first 2 senators from Pennsylvania. And he drew the unfortunate 2-year term for senators. All the senators are elected, And what they do is they draw lots. Who will have a 2-year term? Who will have a 4-year term? Who will have a 6-year term? That's how we get the staggered elections for senators. William McClay drew a 2-year term. He was not reelected. William McClay was either neurotic or psychotic, one or the other, verging to, probably neurotic, verging to psychotic. But he writes a journal, a diary, very extensive, and he's quite illuminating in this journal. And because the sessions of the Senate were secret, the record we have of the Senate is primarily from William McClay. So he is cited all over as if he was one of the Gospels. The fact of the matter is, and whenever I cite William McClay, I always indicate this is a neurotic person giving you this information. And so when he describes Washington in a not too friendly way, or when he describes anybody in a not too friendly way, got to understand this man is nuts. This is not a sane individual we're working with. And historians don't do this. They just cite him as if he's a normal person. And this is obvious, the way he sees it is the way everybody sees it. No, it's not. It's the way a neurotic person sees it. And so be aware of that. Be aware of your sources. Who is telling you the information that you're getting? Are they a reliable source? Now, that's not to denigrate what McClay tells us. A lot of what he tells us is very good. George Washington does that with his fork when he's waiting for the next course of the meal to come. McClay tells us that. Now, I mean, it's nice that he sees that, he tells us that, we get that kind of a clue. How many of you are familiar with the 110 Rules of Civility of George Washington? You know that he didn't write those. They were written by a 16th century French Jesuit priest in Latin. Eventually they're translated into French, then translated into English, and then Washington got a copy, and he wrote down 110 of the rules. This is like Emily Post's rules of etiquette. One of the things is don't tap your pen or your silverware. He says not to do it, but he does it himself. McClay tells us he does it. He also says, we're in baseball season, don't touch certain parts of your body that shouldn't be touched in public. He also says, which my favorite, number 6, is when listening to someone speak, do not fall asleep. Okay? So the rules of etiquette are there, and sometimes they're corroborated by McClay. Or if McClay says, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. This is how he talks when he's talking with a group of senators. He puts his elbow up on the table. This is not the way a secretary of minister should be talking, Secretary of State. But he says, listen to him for 5 minutes. This is a special man. Get rid of this leaning, that's insignificant. This is a special man, he says. Or look at William Plumer's diary, a senator from Vermont. He's an acknowledged hater of Thomas Jefferson. And therefore, the kinds of things that he puts in there in his journal, the commentary, is not going to be very favorable to Thomas Jefferson. As time goes along, he sort of changes. And he says, you know, maybe I was a little too harsh on him. A man is sort of like a city. Looks different from different perspectives. So he gives him a little bit of credit. But he's very, very harsh on Jefferson in the beginning of Jefferson's term. You ought to know why he is that way, because he is not politically attuned to Jefferson. So weigh your evidence. Don't fall in love with your subject. Happens all the time, especially when you're writing biographies. People fall in love with their subject. Have empathy for your subject. Have empathy for the enemies of your subject. Try to understand their motivation. If you're writing on Jefferson, don't just think that Hamilton is terrible. When I went into the seminars with the federal judges, they asked me, have you read McCulloch's book on Adams? Have you read Ron Chernow's book on Hamilton? And so I had a seminar on those two individuals, that is, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. And a lot of the judges read the McCulloch book. How many of you read David McCulloch's book on John Adams? Okay, a handful of you. How many of you read Rod Chernow's book? Did you read the whole book, Keith? Okay. The judges, I'd say 3/4 of the judges read McCulloch's book on John Adams. Maybe a little less than half read Chernow's book on Hamilton. I asked how many of you finished McCulloch. Almost all finished McCulloch. Less than half finished Chernow. It's a tougher read. Physically, the type is smaller and longer, and he's not as good as a writer as McCulloch is. Both books are just filled with errors. Neither one is a historian. The judges said to me, I came away and I was just shocked at how duplicitous Thomas Jefferson was. I couldn't believe it. My response to them was, if you read a biography written by Julian Boyd, a biography of Jefferson written by Julian Boyd, or written by Dumas Malone, 6-volume biography he wrote of Jefferson, you'd come away saying, I never would have believed that John Adams was so duplicitous, or Alexander Hamilton was so duplicitous. And so when you fall in love with your subject, as McCulloch and Chernow both did with their subjects, they cannot do any wrong. There's this much on the alien and sedition laws in McCulloch's book on John Adams. That much. It's a pivotal event in his presidency, but he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't talk about John Jay, the American Experience 2-hour special on the Adamses. And they show the treaty of peace between Great Britain and America. And we get Benjamin Franklin's signature and John Adams' signature. And then comes at the bottom, he cuts it off on television. John Jay's signature doesn't exist. The Soviet historians couldn't have done any better to use their whiteout brush, get rid of John Jay from the story. McCulloch was once asked at a book signing, what about John Jay? He said, well, what about John Jay? You don't talk about John Jay. Well, I don't know anything about him. Well, that's a problem. How can you write the history biography of John Adams and not talk about John Jay? They're integral. He doesn't know about him. Yes?
In those circumstances, for quasi-historians or semi-historians or people in love with history, and you pick up books like you've just described or any number of a handful of others, and we don't operate with the level of detailed knowledge that you have, it seems to me that one of the greatest problems is that people like us pick up these books and rely on them and then turn around and perpetuate the errors that are in those books. Is there any best practice for not doing that, aside from just delving in sort of scattershot to try to further our knowledge?
Yes. The only way I know that these are errors is because I read so extensively. And I read in the, not only the secondary sources, I read the primary sources. I read the documents. And so I know what they're saying. I mean, I've read all of John Adams' writings, all of Abigail Adams' writings. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by having an extensive knowledge and how it's important. The only thing you can do at your level is read balance. If you're going to read a biography of John Adams and you come away thinking what a no good Nick Thomas Jefferson is, read a favorable biography of Thomas Jefferson and balance it out. At least you'll be exposed to the other side, and you'll have to make your own decision then. And when I say the books are filled with error, I'm talking about real objective errors. I'm not talking about interpretation. There's a couple books on Washington written by, I can't remember his name right now. He's a writer, for a television commentator, writes on for a newspaper in Long Island. and he wrote Washington's expense account. It was tongue-in-cheek, and how he exaggerated, put down every little penny. Well, that's how Washington was. He didn't take a salary, but he thought that that was so amusing that Washington would take all his money as his expenses. Then he wrote The Making of the President, and we talked about this morning, about the long S that looks like an F. It's not an F, it's a long S. And the bisector that bisects the F, you know, it doesn't go all the way through on the long S. So when you see in print and it looks like an F, it's really a long S. President, that's not president, it's president. Anyway, The Making of the President, this book. And he comes out and he says, there's not one error of fact in this book. You might disagree with the interpretations. Well, I didn't buy the book because I knew it was filled with all kinds of garbage, among which Washington had homosexual relations with many different young men, including Lafayette and Hamilton. Just ridiculous. My colleague Rich Leffer bought me a copy of the book, and I have it on my shelf. I've never read it. But if you get two good biographies of individuals, one of Adams, one of Jefferson, one of Hamilton, that'll give you a flavoring here. Don't read the same kind of biographies. Don't read only biographies on Adams and expect you're going to get an accurate portrayal of Thomas Jefferson. Yes?
What is the true story of how Washington died?
He stopped breathing. You know, there is this story that goes around on the internet that everybody who signed the Declaration of Independence suffered because of it. They suffered economically, they suffered physically, the British did something terrible to them. And I like to say that's not true, and I know it's not true. Only one person I know suffered, and anybody else would have suffered if you were a patriot, even if you didn't sign the Declaration of Independence. But I make a statement that's true, that you cannot fault me on this. This is about the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Every one of them died. That's an accurate statement, and I challenge you to refute that. Now, what do you mean by Washington's death?
Everyone's heard the story that supposedly he was, visiting the wife of a married woman, and her husband came home, and he was in such a hurry to get out that basically he, I don't know, caught cold or got sick from it, and the doctor that treated him bled him. And
I've never heard of that first part of the story, which is just not at all true. I mean, that part of the story is usually reserved for Gouverneur Morris, who is escaping from different lovers' windows. That's not true either. He lost his leg in a carriage accident, Gouverneur Morris did. Washington was out on the plantations, as he did every day when he was at home, and he was out and it stormed, and he got a cold. And what happened was he got streptococcus, and his windpipe contracted, and he suffocated. That's how he died eventually. Now they took, I thought it was 32 ounces of blood, but I've read another account where that was only in one day, that they took about 50 some ounces of blood from him. Didn't kill him, but it really weakened him tremendously. There were a number of doctors there, and there's a very good account of his death by Tobias Lear, who was his personal secretary for many years. And he's not speaking very much. He was very brave in his death. He faced it very stoically. He knew this was the end. He had only one request: don't bury me, I'm dead for 2 days. He didn't want to be buried alive, which happened sometimes back in those days. And so there were a number of doctors there, a father-son team. The son said, let's do a tracheotomy, which was radical stuff back then. Would have saved his life, but they decided not to do it. Would you want to slit the throat of the father of your country? And so he died from streptococcus. So I'm doing one of the, Bill said I have 11 books, 12 books. I want to write. I'm writing 5 of them right now, off and on. And one of them is Death and the Founders. I got interested in death because of Abigail Adams, my work on her. And 1 out of every 4 or 1 out of every 3 letters when she's at home talks about death. So she really talks about death a lot. Death was part of her everyday life because her family was the town. And whenever anybody died in the town, she's talking about it. And sometimes it could be quite extensive, dysentery, wiping out a whole family, or certainly affecting every family. Her children, and she got the dysentery. They all survived, but her mother treated her, and her mother died from dysentery. And so in the back of this book, I would have how different people died, how Washington died, how Patrick Henry died. He finally went to the physician of last resorts. You know how they'd like to have doctors have a rating today, how successful they are or how unsuccessful they are. And you want to go to a successful doctor if you're having surgery, right? He'd been to all the doctors, and they couldn't help him. Finally, he goes to the doctor of last resort, who doesn't have a very good record. And the doctor gives him his prescription. He says, take this. It will either cure you or it will kill you, one or the other. It was liquid mercury, and it killed him. That was the end of Patrick Henry. So each person has their own little story of how they died, and it's sometimes very interesting. It's interesting how Jefferson and Adams die on the same day, the 4th of July, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the approval of the Declaration of Independence. Yes?
What was wrong with Patrick?
I don't know, but he had a chronic disease. They just couldn't get over it. But they used mercury to treat syphilis. I'm not saying he had syphilis, but that was one of Jefferson writes this wonderful letter to a doctor explaining about medicine and how he thinks medicine is very important, how the body is a wonderful machine, and it's like anything in the universe. It wants to be in order. And if it's not in order, it's having a problem. It's diseased. And if it gets out of order enough, it dies. But there is something in nature that will get the body back in order, even if there's no medication. But we have found through trial and error that certain medications speed up the recovery process. And that's a wonderful thing. But there are so many illnesses and so many combinations of illnesses in the body that we don't have remedies for all of them. And doctors shouldn't be going out on a limb. He said one of my I don't want to say closest friend, but one of his closest doctors that he's associated with says, I have saved more people's lives with red pills and colored water than with medicines. And it's important, Jefferson says, to keep up the morale and the hope of the patient. This is an important process here. But don't come up with theories, or you're a young doctor, that you treat this diseased person here, and he happens to get better. Maybe it's not because of your medication. Maybe it's despite your medication. And then you use it for somebody else, and they'll have a reaction to it and die. So Jefferson is quite concerned about keeping the body in order and not experimenting here. So don't fall in love with your subject. Have empathy. You know, back in the 1970s, the position of editor-in-chief of the John Adams papers came about, and I thought about applying for that, but I didn't have any empathy for John Adams. I've written 2 books on Abigail Adams. I have tremendous empathy for John Adams, far more for Abigail than for John. She was quite the person, being able to live with John Adams. And so I have empathy for both of them now. Be aware of the language change. There's changes in the language. And so I'll give you a couple examples. He gave a nervous speech. What do you think that means? a nervous speech.
Speech on being nervous?
No, just he was nervous.
Today's language or?
And back in the 18th century, he was nervous when he gave his speech.
Highly energetic, maybe.
What was that?
Highly energetic,
Why do you say that?
just the context it's used in.
Okay. What about being agitated, nervous, afraid? But no, it is somewhat, like you say, it is powerful. It is comes from the core word nerve, to have nerve. So it doesn't mean what we would think today, nervous, agitated. Doesn't mean that. Or Washington gave a pathetic speech when he surrendered his commission. Pathetic, we think of maudlin, overly emotional, and sickening. But it's from the core word pathos. And so it means filled with emotion, powerful, filled with emotion. Everybody was crying because of the pathetic speech. Want. You want something. Means you desire something, right? Well, it means lack. Back then, when they used the word want, it often means lack. The want of money. Jefferson says, the want of money cramps every effort. Isn't that true? Both today and back then. 7 words. The Bible says it more succinctly. Money answereth all things. So only 4 words rather than 7 words. Same idea is expressed. But want means lack at the time. Repair. I used the word repair in my dissertation. Jensen slapped me right down. When I went to Washington, D.C. for 7 months, I wrote in the mornings, and I wrote in the evenings, and I wrote in the weekends. I came back with my first chapter, 82 pages long, of the dissertation. When Jensen finished it, it was 12 pages long. So I lost 70 pages. And told me never use the word repair the way I used it in the 17th century sense. Repair means to go. He repaired to his home. It doesn't mean to fix back then. So the language has changed, and you should be aware of that. One of the things, I had a graduate student, she took an independent course from me, and the course was to read all of the 1,161 letters between John and Abigail Adams. All of these are online, easy enough to get. And she would come in every Monday, and we'd talk for 3 hours. She didn't understand all the language. She asked me questions about the language. And so I bought her a dictionary, 1806 Webster's Dictionary, online, cost $10. It's reprinted in 1950, and so we have one for our project. I bought 2, one for her and one for me to take home. And you can look up in the dictionary and see what the words meant. And the words are important because language is a difficult thing. This is a quotation from James Madison on language, the Federalist number 37. You didn't read this, did you? James Madison is a great writer. You take a 2-page letter, we abstract that 2-page letter, and it is 4 pages long. He just writes with great concision and is a very mechanical writer. He is not the poet that Thomas Jefferson is. And so one of my rules here that I've given to you is read slowly. Read a second time. We read documents over and over and over again, and you get different things out of those documents different times. You can't gloss over 18th century writing. It is just too convoluted, generally. You have to spend time with it. The judges, I have to get them not to read the documents I give them the way they read a brief. You got to spend time with this. And Madison is one of those people who is not very eloquent. But when you read what he says, you say, my goodness, how could he think in those the way he does. How could he do it? Very, very few times when he really is eloquent. But it's a different kind of writing. And this is how he writes about language. And I'll go through it slowly. Not because you're elementary, middle, and high school teachers. I do the same thing with judges. To understand what he is saying. It is not easy to grasp it if you go through quickly. But you got to think what he's talking about. Language. The use of words is to express ideas. Perspicuity. You know what that means? Perspicuity. Anyone know what that means? The ability to focus and use the right words for what you want to express. That's perspicuity. That gets me to another issue that I'll talk about, knowing vocabulary. But remember, I'm going to speak on that. Perspicuity, therefore, requires, that is, if we can use the right words, requires not only that the ideas should be distinctly formed, but that they should be expressed by words distinctly and exclusively appropriated to them. We use the right words. But no language is so copious, no language is broad enough here, as to supply words and phrases for every complex idea. I was helping a Japanese professor do a translation of the Federalist Papers. And there were certain concepts, certain words, that they had no Japanese word. And so every language doesn't have a word for the different ideas that are expressed, or so correct as not to include many equivocally donating different ideas, so that some words give two different meanings. And so you have to use it the right way. Hence, it must happen that however accurately objects may be discriminated in themselves, and however accurately the discrimination may be considered, the definition of them may be rendered inaccurate by the inaccuracy of the terms in which it is delivered. And so if the writer doesn't write it using the right words, or if the reader doesn't read it with the right definitions of the words, you've got a problem. And this unavoidable inaccuracy must be greater or less according to the complexity and novelty of the objects defined. When the Almighty himself condescends to address mankind in their own language, his meaning, luminous as it must be, is rendered dim and doubtful by the cloudy medium through which it is communicated. The cloudy medium, the English language, is that cloudy medium. Now, I wrote 5 encyclopedia articles a couple years ago for Milestones in American History. It's online. You can see it's a wonderful production. You can buy it online if you want. Each individual one is, I think, $35, $45, something like that. 5,000 words. And they told us how to divide it. 500 words on the author, 500 words with the quotations, and they wanted us to do vocabulary. And so 75, 85 words. And I did Washington's first inaugural address, Washington's farewell address, Jefferson's first inaugural address, the Northwest Ordinance, and Washington's first address to Congress. Those are my 5. And I've read those documents many times before, so I knew what they said. But when I identified those 75 words, I defined them, I had a new appreciation for what the document said. Because, to put it in terms of a commercial on television, Clarendon Clear, do you know Clarendon? You know that commercial where it's fuzzy and then they zip away that foam, that penumbra? You know what penumbra means? Penumbra used by William Douglas in the Supreme Court decision. If you go out some night and you see the haze on the moon, that's a penumbra. The haze that's there. when you read a document and you are not knowledgeable about the words, what the words really mean. I read those documents, Washington's first inaugural address, 20 times before. I knew what he was saying, but I didn't have that precision. I didn't have that clarity and clear vision of what he was actually saying. I hope he had a clear vision of what he was writing. That is what James Madison was writing when he wrote the inaugural address for Washington. But I understood it better. And it's because of the way we learn vocabulary. I mean, sometimes we have a basic vocabulary lesson. I remember in elementary school how we had vocabulary lesson every week, and we learned new words and what they meant. But most of the time, especially when we're adults, I think, we don't have a dictionary by our side. And we read and we understand from context. But as Madison says, we don't get exactly what the word means. And so I would say, advocate, have that dictionary by your side. When you're reading a word they don't understand, look it up, see what it means. It will help you, especially when you're reading the documents. If you're preparing the documents for your students and you don't understand some of the words, look up those words so that you do know when your students will ask you, what does that word mean? You'll know what it means. A friend of mine, he teaches at Sandy High School in Utah. And he announces the football and the basketball games in the stadium, and it's broadcast over the radio. And he liked to put some novel words in. Breaking through the bulwark of the line. Words that are not normally spoken by broadcasters. And what happened was the English department at Sandy High School said to him, let's do this together. And they give him between 5 and 10 words for every game, and he puts these words into his broadcasts. And when he does, after he does it, he says, another word brought to you by the English department from Sandy High School. And he is educating his clientele, listening. It's a wonderful thing. And the students love it. And in the stands, there's a cheer when this happens. Another word from Sandy High School. And so vocabulary grows here. And it's a good thing for that to happen with these documents. Be aware of the customary etiquette of the time. I mentioned Washington's rules of civility, 110 rules of civility. But when you're looking at letters, this is sort of an interesting thing, I think. When Washington writes to somebody that he doesn't know, he gets a lot of letters from people that he doesn't know who they are. He will respond to them. This is true of everybody at the time, not just Washington, Jefferson, Madison. Sir, Madame. That's how he addresses them. Then he gets to know the people, and he writes to them, dear sir, dear Madame. But then he becomes intimate with them. The workings of the letters between Jefferson, Madison, and Washington. It now becomes, my dear sir, my dear general, my dear Lafayette. And whenever it becomes my dear somebody, look at the end of Washington's letter. It is no longer your humble and obedient servant, which is the vernacular for sincerely yours. It is your humble and obedient servant with great esteem. The word esteem is put in virtually every single time. Look at Madison when he writes to Edmund Randolph, my dear friend. That hardly ever happens. They're very formal. And so look at that formality. Look at the way they express themselves, and you'll see relationships that are there. Look at the words ultimo or instant. They often will refer what they received in their opening. received yours of the 15th ultimo, that is the previous month, or received yours of the 10th instant this month. And they're letting each other know that the mail has gotten through, that I've seen your letter. And they keep tabs that way. So there are these different clues that give you some idea of what the letters are all about. Read slowly, I said. Reread multiple times with difficult items. Take notes, as Madison did in the Congress and the convention, of your documents, the high point, and then the subpoints under it, to understand what they're saying. I just did that last night. I brought along with me one of 2 volumes of Benjamin Rush's letters, and I'm marking it up. I bought these 2 volumes, only $30 through a used bookstore, and I like to mark up my books. And so I thought it would be nice here to mention to you what he said. This is for the American Revolution, which we'll talk about in our next session. 5 different kinds of wigs. What's a wig? What's that? No, a wig. W-H-I-G-S. Wigs, yes, a political party. What is a wig?
It's kind of like our modern day independent, I guess.
Okay.
There was no Republican and Democrat at that time, so it was always a wig.
Okay. What was he? A Republican, Democrat today, or what? National Republicans.
Arising out of England, weren't they the responsive faction to the Tories or the
Absolutely.
Conservative of the day?
Absolutely. The English political parties were Tories and Whigs. And during the 17th century, when the Stuart kings were on the throne, James I took the throne in 1603 with the death of Elizabeth. She had no children. And then you go James I, Charles I, his son, and then the English Civil War, where he is executed, and you have the Commonwealth period for 20 years. And then that's so chaotic that when Oliver Cromwell, who's ruling with an iron fist, when he dies, chaos for 2 years, and then you get Charles II invited back from France. He's the son of Charles I, and he becomes king again. The monarchy is reestablished. The House of Lords reestablished. And then when he dies, his brother, James II, takes office, and he also is quite autocratic, and he is also Catholic. I mean, about as worse as you can be. Autocratic and Catholic at that time in England is a terrible thing. And when he has his first wife was Protestant, and so their daughter is raised as a Protestant and goes and marries William of Orange in the Netherlands. And then his first wife dies, and he marries a Catholic, and they have a Catholic son. That stimulates the Glorious Revolution. And there's an uprising against James II for any number of things. But this is the thing that pushes it over, that he's going to have a Catholic heir to the throne. A Catholic boy is now born. And so James II is thrown off, and William and Mary come and are invited to be king and queen. Mary is his Protestant, James II's Protestant daughter. And so during this particular time, 1603 to 1688, 12 of the 13 American colonies are established. And so there's 22,000 pamphlets that are published in England during that 85-year period of time, discussing the nature of government and how to preserve liberty. Different points of view. The king should be all-powerful. The king should not be all-powerful. And you have the Tories expressing the king's side and the Whigs expressing Parliament's side. So the Whigs are those people who oppose monarchical prerogatives, that the king could do basically whatever he wants. These are generally outsiders who fear government. Jefferson says there are 2 kinds of people. 2 kinds of people who fall in 2 different political parties. There are the people who fear the people, who want strong government, and then you have people who fear government and want safeguards on their government. The people who fear government are Whigs, generally speaking. The people who fear people are Tories, and they want strong government. They're the conservatives. Today in England, the Tories have defeated the Labour Party, which would have been considered Whigs, and the Liberals would also be considered Whigs, and they're in coalition with the Tories right now, which is a strange combination. So Whigs here. He said there are 5 different kinds of Whigs, Benjamin Rush. The Whig from a love of power. That is, they want to be in power, and they want to be revolutionaries. This is the way to get power. The Whig from resentment. That is, they are angry at somebody else, either angry at the king or angry at others in their colony, would be Tories. The Whig from interest. That is, they hope to make some money off of this. The Whig from a love of military life. They want to be in the army. They like this kind of thing. Benjamin Rush does not like to be in the army, so he points it out. The Whig from the love of liberty. That's the true Whig. That's who he thinks he is. From liberty. I favor liberty. He says, in writing to James Searle, I don't know who James Searle is. I just read this last night. One of my marks, you know, of a good Whig is that he must not grow rich during the war. This is 1778. One of yours is that he cannot be a good Whig unless he grows poor during the war. You got to give up your interests. You got to work for the public good, and you're going to suffer. John Adams suffers. His legal career is ended. He sees other men of less ability making huge amounts of money, and he is not, because he's in the public service. He sees his children not being educated the right way because he's not there. He's giving up a great deal. That's what you have to do. That's what Benjamin Rush admires. You get William Bingham. How many of you know William Bingham? Not a one of you? Am I not surprised? Not at all. You shouldn't know William Bingham. William Bingham was a prosperous merchant in Philadelphia. He marries a beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful woman in America at the time. And he goes down to Martinique, and he is the American agent in this French island that is funneling all the French goods to America. And he's charging a commission. He becomes one of the wealthiest men in early America because he makes all this money from his job. This is not a true Whig, according to Benjamin Rush. He has ulterior motives here. Thomas Paine believed there were 3 kinds of men: the willing but unable, the willing and able, and the able but unwilling. Where do you fall among those 3 types of individuals? Let me see. Rush, I wrote down another thing that he said in 1778. But our country is still in danger, not of being conquered, but of groaning under all the calamities of a tedious, expensive, and desolating war, not from the power of Britain, nor the machinations of the Tories, but from the ignorance, indolence, and avarice of too many of our Whigs. And so you got to watch out for, even your own friends can have ulterior motives here. Okay, I've got a few more of these to go, but we'll get through them very quickly in our next session. Let's take about, how much? 10 or 15 minutes. About a 10 or 15 minute break.
Let's take a break.